In the previous chapters, we've looked at the institutions of monetary and fiscal policy. And in this week of the course, we're going to look at not the institutions, not sort of what it is, but the sort of should questions. When should we use monetary policy, fiscal policy? When should the Fed, for example, expand or contract the money supply? When should Congress use deficit spending or other tools of fiscal policy? That's what we're going to do in chapters 16 and 18. Here in chapter 16, we'll focus on monetary policy. From the start, what we have to recognize is that we can draw up monetary policy on the blackboard, and we can sort of illustrate the ideal of monetary policy and say, look, here's what the Fed, the central bank, should do. And if we have a sort of drop in aggregate demand, for example, if, say, entrepreneurs' expectations fall, they're not as optimistic about the economy, they don't want to invest as much, aggregate demand curve shifts in towards the origin, we see a fall in GDP, perhaps a rise in unemployment, and we want to counteract it. And it seems like an obvious and easy case where what we should do, perhaps, is to expand the money supply. If we expand the money supply, we will enable ourselves to push that aggregate demand curve. We'll increase spending and push that aggregate demand curve back up. We'll reduce unemployment. We'll increase GDP, and things will be fine. And it looks like it's pretty easy and straightforward. And certainly that's the ideal, right, that we might draw up on the blackboard. But there's a number of reasons why we want to be skeptical about whether that's what the central bank can actually do. There's a few reasons for that skepticism. One of them is the existence of lags. Okay, so for example, it takes time for the Fed to collect the data on the economy. The Fed exists, as the book puts it, in real time, right? The central bank has to figure out what's happening and has to figure out what data it has and what that data suggests. And even once it gets that data, it has to take the time to figure out what it wants to do. It takes time to actually execute that policy, for that policy to work its way through. And by the time, let's say, we've expanded the money supply in response to a fall in aggregate demand, by the time that worked its way through the system and by the time it becomes effective in terms of affecting real economic variables, the change in aggregate demand may have reversed itself, right? Or the economy may have already recovered and responded. Entrepreneurial expectations may have shifted back. And if we do that, we ended up sort of turning what we would call counter-cyclical policy, that is, policy that tries to prevent the economy from doing this and make it more like this, we might turn that into pro-cyclical. We might amplify the swings by getting our timing wrong. So one of the problems that monetary policy faces in the real world, right, is that these lags and this challenge of collecting and analyzing data is one that it has to deal with. And if it guesses wrong, it may make matters worse rather than better. More generally, it's important to remember the discussion we just had from chapter 21 about public choice theory. We can't assume that the actors who run the Federal Reserve or the members of Congress who oversee it are necessarily able to identify the public interest or have the incentive to act within that public interest. Members of the Federal Reserve have their own interests at stake. They also have to respond to the incentives created to them by Congress and so forth. So it might well be the case, for example, that in the time leading up to an election, the pressure from the president is strong and Congress is strong to make the economy look good. The central bank may feel that pressure and may decide to engage in short-run expansion that generates positive effects in the short run, even if it has costs in the long run. That might not be the ideal policy we would like to have, but again, another way that the reality of policy making deviates from the ideal is that it's subject to political pressure, that there are public choice considerations that we have to take into consideration. With all that in mind, okay, what in fact can monetary policy do? What are some guidelines? What are some concerns we might have as we think about it? We'll start by saying, echoing the book, that this is a very, very difficult task. The task given to a monetary authority of having discretion, the ability to decide exactly what the money supply should be, well, technically what the level of reserve should be, with the hope of influencing the money supply and influencing interest rates and real variables. That discretion is powerful. It's also very difficult to manage well. And even if we assume that Federal Reserve officials are seeking after the public interest, identifying what that public interest is, and being able to pick the right monetary policy and handle all the variables involved to get there is really, really tricky. Remember, one of the challenges facing the central bank, right, is that whatever it does is dependent upon other people doing things too. So the Fed can inject reserves into the banking system, but if banks don't want to lend and if people don't want to spend, it's not going to do any good. So all of the models that we think about as we think about a central bank saying if we inject this amount of reserves, what will be the effect on the money supply and then interest rates and output? All of those are subject to factors that the central bank cannot control. The decisions that we make, even about how much currency to hold, can affect the influence that any given change in reserve has on the money supply and then those other real variables. We've certainly seen this in the last decade, right, as the Fed expanded the reserve significantly, but banks, for one reason being that they were getting paid to, as we talked about in the previous chapter, getting paid interest on them, but banks have held those reserves and haven't spent them. So all those reserves have been pushed out, but banks are holding them and not lending them, so we haven't seen any real effect in terms of the money supply and those other variables. But one thing the central bank can sort of control is how credible its monetary policy is. Central banks who say they're going to do something and do it are going to be more effective than ones who say they're going to do something, then don't do it or do it sort of halfway or start doing it and back off. Right? The key is to be credible. And the book has a number of good examples of this. Certainly, if one of the best is the disinflation of the late 70s, early 80s, when under Paul Volcker, the Fed decided to bring down the inflation rate from 13 or 14%. It said it was going to do it, and it did it. It was painful. It generated a recession in the early 80s, unemployment around 10%. But we got through that, and once we got through it, right, we set off perhaps one of the longest peacetime expansions in U.S. history throughout the 80s and 90s, and really up until 2001, and then eventually the financial crisis later on. But that was the key to doing that. Was it said it was going to do something, and it said it was going to be painful, and it continued to do it and stuck with it even through the pain. So that credibility of monetary policy is very important. There is a temptation to want to use monetary policy when faced with a negative real shock. The best example of this is something like a restriction in the supply of oil that raises oil prices, right? We can show, as the book does, that that's going to shift the long-run aggregate supply curve to a lower point, right? That our growth over time, our current GDP and our growth over time is going to be lower as a result of that. It is tempting to want to say, all right, let's respond to that with an increase in spending through expansionary monetary policy, and the hope would be that in the short run we would generate some real effect. We would push output up and we would push unemployment down. But as the textbook points out, the problem with this is in the face of a real shock, right? In the face of something like those oil prices going up, the effect on output of that increase in the money supply of expansionary monetary policy is going to be very small. We know that in the long run, output growth are affected by real factors, not monetary factors. Okay, and all we're really going to do is buy ourselves some inflation in the short run. And so here's a good example of where it looks like on the blackboard that monetary policy might be helpful, but actually the best policy in this case may be to do nothing. And one way to think about that is, if it's really the case, and let's take the easy case first, let's say there's been some kind of natural disaster that's destroyed some oil fields or some oil refineries, right? We want the price of oil to go up. We want, in some sense, the economy should slow down. We want it, but it should slow down to reflect the fact that this important resource, oil, is now more scarce. That's what rising prices, that's what the shrinking long-run aggregate supply curve are all about. So that's a good thing. We don't want to counteract that with monetary policy. We want the real economy to send those real signals. It's a little more complicated perhaps when we get something like OPEC, where we get an artificial restriction on the supply of oil and oil prices go up. But even there, monetary policy, even though we might say, well, that's not a good thing or we don't want that to happen, right? Monetary policy is not going to help. Right? There's nothing that monetary policy can do to improve on that outcome over time. Right? If that's the way to solve that problem is through other methods that perhaps break up OPEC or look for alternative supplies of oil. One of the real dangers here is that monetary policy can also overshoot. If monetary policy overexpands, right, and we get an excessive amount of credit expansion, one of the things we'll see happen is we'll see interest rates fall and send out a distorted signal, right? That those lower interest rates are not the result, if you go back to our chapter on savings and the interest rate, are not the result of people wanting to save more. Rather, that lower interest rate is the result of expansionary monetary policy that makes it look like people want to save more when they really don't. That's going to send out, again, a false, a distorted interest rate signal. That's going to lead investors, entrepreneurs in the marketplace to make bad decisions about what they want to do. So, for example, with lower interest rates, entrepreneurs are going to find longer term, more processes of production more profitable, ones that involve more steps, more stages in production. They're going to invest in those because it's going to look like people want to wait. It looks like people have saved more and they're more patient, but they really haven't. And as a result of that, we have a mismatch between the actual preferences of entrepreneurs on one side and the preferences of consumers on one side and the behavior of entrepreneurs on another. Entrepreneurs think consumers are willing to wait when they're really not. Consumers' preferences haven't changed. It's a false signal being sent by the interest rate. And so what happens here is we can get an artificial boom, right, as the funds, low interest rate, and entrepreneurs borrow that money and invest. But at some point, they're going to realize those investments, those decisions they made weren't profitable. When they see that those aren't profitable, the boom is going to turn to bust. We're going to get a recession. And you can think of this as a discoordination between the intertemporal preferences of consumers and entrepreneurs. And this is one story of the business cycle. It's a story associated with the Austrian School of Economics. Your book mentions the economists Ludwig von Mises and F.A. Hayek, who were proponents of this theory, especially back in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. Made a comeback because it seemed to explain pretty well what happened with the housing crisis. We had an expansionary policy. People invested in housing and other long-term goods. Wasn't what consumers wanted, and eventually those investments in housing turned out to be unprofitable. We had a bust and a recession. So this is a danger, right, with monetary policy. If the monetary authority overshoots, if it expands credit too much, we can generate this kind of business cycle. Last thing to mention with monetary policy is the debate over rules versus discretion. As I said at the start, right, central banks have discretion. They have complete choice over what it is that they do with the policies they adopt. And many people argue that this is the problem, right? And it would be better, rather than giving them the discretion and the ability to make these mistakes we've been talking about, whether by accident or more as part of a conscious strategy, wouldn't it be better to bind them to rules? Early on, people like Milton Friedman said, let's just have a simple monetary growth rule where we say the growth in the money supply has to be X percent, let's say 3% per year. That's the Fed's job. All the Fed does is do what it takes to generate 3% growth in the money supply per year. More recently, people have talked about other kinds of rules that would bind the Fed. The hope with all of these is by taking away discretion, we take away the Fed's ability to make those mistakes, particularly the mistakes on the expansion side. All right, but what's the danger of binding the Fed to a rule? The danger is if real variables really do change, right? The public's time preferences change, or if the public's demand to hold money changes, we might want the Fed to actually change its policy. We might want it to deviate, say, from 3% if real variables suggest that that's necessary. And if you bind the Fed to a rule, it can't do that, right? It can't tinker with that to sort of adjust to what the real variables are. And so one of the costs of having a monetary rule is we have to accept a certain amount of variability and volatility because we're binding ourselves to that rule. The argument is, but by binding ourselves to that rule, we're better off in the long run by avoiding the mistakes and the mistakes of discretion than we are of losing the potential gains. And remember, those potential gains from discretion, that ability to tinker with the money supply to match real variables, we've already talked about is subject to lags and so on and so forth. So there's a pretty good case for a rule over discretion here, and certainly a lot of the talk these days is about how we might bind the Fed to such a rule to prevent the kinds of problems that we've seen. But this is an old debate in monetary policy among economists of rules versus discretion. One thing you might think about is whether the fact that there's sort of no winning choice here suggests that we might want to also think about alternatives to central banking. Are there other ways to organize our banking system that would be superior to central banking? And some economists have talked about this question, talked about what's known as a free banking system, where both production of checking account dollars and currency are decided competitively by banks. Banks decide what they want to make those redeemable in, whether it's gold or something else, and we get real market competition into banking. That's a topic that's a little bit beyond what we do in an intro class, but certainly if you continue on taking more econ, especially if you take monetary policy here at Ball State, you'll certainly have an opportunity to talk more about those kinds of questions. So that's a quick overview of monetary policy. I think the key point here is that just because we draw it up on the blackboard doesn't mean we can execute it, whether it's for public choice type reasons about the incentives facing monetary policymakers, or whether it's about things like the data that they have, the knowledge that they have, or the lags that they face as they try to execute monetary policy.